Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Ed Leaders Network live event, Supporting the Shift to Inquiry. My name is Arlen Peebles, and I will be your host and technical support for the webinar. I want to draw your attention to the GoToWebinar control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. This is how you interact with us today, and I want to go over just a couple of the options. First is audio. If you open up that audio panel, you're going to see that you're joined most likely with computer audio. That is preferred. That's the best way to hear us. But if you're having any trouble, you can switch over to a phone call, and a teleconference number will appear for you there. I also want you to look at the questions box. You can type your questions as you think of them. We're going to have time at the end to do a Q&A, but as the question pops up in your mind, go ahead and type it into the box. It'll be saved for our Q&A, and we'll draw on it later. And then, of course, there is the chat pod, which you can chat with me here if you have any technical issues. All right, so if there aren't any questions yet, that's good. That means you're all hearing me loud and clear. I'd like to turn things over to our presenter, Shanti Alangopan. Shanti, good morning.
Good morning, Arlen. Thanks for having me. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here today on this webinar, Supporting the Shift to Inquiry. I am the CEO and founder of InquireEd. And for those of you who don't know who InquireEd is, I'll talk a little bit about us just for a second so you know who we are. But thanks for joining us today. We're going to just start with kind of an agenda so you understand kind of where we're going in this webinar. We'll start, as I said, just with a super quick, who is InquireEd, what do we have to do with inquiry, and why are we talking about this subject today? What is inquiry? I think it's always really important just to norm a bit in terms of thinking about terms that are used out there. There are a lot of different terms. And so what we mean when we say inquiry and how we define it. And then kind of really diving deep into thinking about why it's hard to shift. So if you're on this webinar, I'm assuming that you may be having some conversations in your school, in your district, about shifting to an inquiry-based model. And you're thinking about, all right, what are some of the challenge areas and what's kind of what you need to contend with, and maybe already kind of in some of those challenges. And so that section of why it's hard to shift is really what we've heard from districts and schools across the country, and kind of codifying those into what we see as kind of the biggest challenges. Then we'll kind of shift into thinking about, all right, well, what's your goal for inquiry? And really thinking about what's specific to your context, and not just thinking about a goal that inquiry looks like the same everywhere, but really thinking about what the goal looks like in your space. And then really jumping into finding your path. So what does it look like to move from where you are right now to moving to that goal of inquiry? And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So as Arlen said, please put your questions in the chat, and in the questions section, and we'll make sure to address those at the end. So let's start with who is InquireEd. So InquireEd, we are kind of, we are fanatical about inquiry. We believe very deeply in what it does for students. We believe that it prepares students for not only the world they'll be living in tomorrow, but the world that they live in today, to be active citizens, to be really media literate, to be problem solvers, to be critical thinkers, to be all the things we need them to be in the world that we're living in right now, and the world that they'll be living in several years from now. So the way we do that is through two things. We do it through curriculum. For example, our Inquiry Journeys curriculum, which is an elementary social studies curriculum. We have another curriculum product that is a kind of a project-based learning, inquiry-based learning product, and then our professional learning, things like on-site professional development, professional learning courses that are virtual that we provide for instructional leaders, lots of PD that goes with our curriculum, lots of different things. So everything that we do is kind of a suite of tools that really provides schools and districts with the tools they need to move to an inquiry-based model. So what is inquiry? I think there are a lot of terms, as I mentioned earlier, out there. And what I found is that depending on your context, you might be using a very different term for inquiry. And we think at InquireEd of an inquiry as an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different practices. And it can look different based on where you are. So some people might move inquiry to a more project-based learning model. Some people use the term student-centered learning, some people deeper learning. There are a lot of other terms out there. And what we think of is that inquiry is an umbrella term that can encompass these different models: place-based learning, experiential learning, that all really move towards a model where students are really leading the learning, that starts with a question. that students always are asking questions, being given questions, and that those questions are open-ended, compelling questions that move students through a rigorous investigation. That they're not just going through and saying, okay, let me look at this particular content for 45 minutes and that's the end. That they're going through a rigorous investigation. They're looking at multiple sources. They're thinking about things from different perspectives, from different lenses. And they're coming to their own conclusions. They're not being given the answers, but they're coming to their own conclusion, and they're doing something with those conclusions. That they're not just learning for learning's sake. They're not just sitting and getting, but they're moving towards informed action. That rigorous investigation has really informed them about a topic area, and then they're doing something and they're taking action. And that taking action can take a lot of different forms. It could be as simple as thinking about informing their school building, the people in their school building, the administration, about a policy and how that might be affecting the students. It could be informing a lower grade level about an issue that's happening in the community. And it can go all the way to a community action product that really is having a really deep impact on the local community. So that can look a lot of different ways, but at all times that students are moving towards that action piece. What we think that does for students and why we believe in inquiry is really this idea of saying when we humans are engaged in action, when they actually do something what they learn, that's when the deep learning happens. That you're not just learning for content's sake, but you're applying skills, that you're having to go think critically about that content and not just being told to think critically about that content. Things like that are really when we see content and skills coming together and really that kind of magic of learning occurring. So we've kind of talked a little bit about the what and why of inquiry, but why is this hard? Like, why is this not just something that you can do, no problem, jump into inquiry? Well, one of the biggest things that we've heard from schools and districts administrators is that one of the biggest problems is shifting teacher practice. I'll often hear from principals, from district administrators, that their teachers haven't been trained to teach this way. They haven't come out of teacher preparation programs knowing what an inquiry-based model looks like. And so what they often say is, all right, so we tried a 1 or 2 day professional development. We had somebody come out to us. We come by and say, okay, let's really dive deep into inquiry. Or they might send a couple of teachers out to a conference and go think deeply about what an inquiry model looks like. But the problem with that PD kind of drive-by model is that inquiry isn't just shifting what you teach. It's not just changing, okay, I used to teach about ancient Egypt and now I'm going to teach about ancient China. You're not just changing the content or changing it's about changing the how of how you teach. And so just a PD in a 1 or 2 day model might just be about kind of the high level pedagogy of what a shift looks like, but it doesn't get you down to the day-to-day classroom instruction. Like, how does that connect to what I'm doing in the classroom? And so it's often not enough. That 1 or 2 day PD or training or conference just doesn't get teachers where you need them to be. And so this is kind of where administrators or teachers will just throw their hands up and say, forget it. Like, it's not going to happen in our space. One of the other pieces that we hear across the board as a real challenge for making a shift to inquiry is a lack of curricular supports. So in some ways, the idea of curriculum and inquiry has been thought for a long time to be antithetical to each other, that these two things that can't go together. That because inquiry can't be scripted, right? If I tell students the answer, or if I give them a textbook and the answer is if I have a question on one page and I turn the page and on the next page is the answer, that's not inquiry, right? I haven't had the students draw their own conclusions. I haven't had them look at multiple sources, multiple perspectives. I haven't had them do the investigating. So how can this look? If I can't have a textbook, if I can't have this kind of scripted model, how do I give curricular supports? And so if I don't give curriculum supports, I have all sorts of other problems. I might have a couple of teachers, this kind of pockets of inquiry that often occur where you have 1 or 2 teachers really running with it. But the rest of your teachers, it's really difficult to get it off the ground. And you have codification issues. No one's thinking about the vertical alignment. What does it look like? What is the experience that students are having in 2nd grade that leads to the experience they're having in 3rd grade, that scaffolds to the experience they're having in 4th, 5th, 6th, and beyond? What does it look like to align to standards? So if I don't have a curricular tool, how do I make sure that we're hitting on the standards that my state has said I need to be hitting on? Assessment. If my students are going in all different directions and I don't have a curricular tool that's really guiding that work, what does assessment look like? How do I think about what is the experience the students are having in this classroom versus this classroom, and thinking about how they're being assessed? And all sorts of other issues that happen when we don't have a curricular support for teachers to be able to implement in the classroom. And so often I hear from schools and districts, I don't have a curriculum to support this, so we can't do inquiry in our space. The kind of big bucket third challenge that I hear from administrators across the country is shifting to inquiry takes time. And I should say a caveat to this one. I guess maybe this is one that I don't hear that often. I don't actually hear administrators say this, but what I see is that they really struggle when they are going into inquiry. And I see people trying it out and they'll say, well, we tried out this particular model. We tried to do the one-day PD. We tried to do this. We brought in this particular curricular support. We tried to have a couple teachers go write curriculum, and they get a few months into it, and it's hard, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. Changing teaching practice isn't going to happen overnight. Thinking about all of this alignment to assessment to standards to all of these things, it takes time. And it's not something that is even going to happen in a year. It's a multi-year ongoing journey. It's a process that's going to happen. And so that means administrators really sticking with the goal, even when you're not seeing immediate results. And that's not easy when you've got multiple people coming at you and saying, hey, why are we doing this? What's the reason for doing this? Where is this leading to us? It can be really overwhelming, and sometimes the chorus of kind of naysayers can be a real reason of saying, okay, forget it. This isn't going to work. This is going to take too much time. So what I say to folks when they ask me about how they can start the process of shifting to inquiry, what I say is, well, there's a lot of challenges and there are a lot of reasons why this work is hard. And the first thing that I would suggest to you is to start with the goal. Oftentimes people think that inquiry means that it is all the same across the board, that there is one inquiry model and you're trying to take that inquiry model and put it into your context. And what we feel at InquireEd is that it really doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all model, that it can look like a lot of different things. And there's a image, this is actually something that has been adapted by Trevor McKenzie, if you've ever read any of his books on inquiry. That was a model of kind of what inquiry looks like from a book that came out a long time ago that he adapted. But this model of thinking about kind of a swimming pool and what different models of inquiry can look like can really help you to think about what your goal is for inquiry. So starting on the left-hand side, structured inquiry, where students are really following the lead of the teacher. The teacher is setting up the inquiry, and there is one inquiry that the entire class is going through. So they're starting with a compelling question, but the teachers are really setting up that work. Moving towards controlled inquiry, where teachers might be choosing some topics and identifying resources, but students are really starting to kind of go in a little bit of their own lanes. Continuing to move down the continuum to guided inquiry, where teachers are still choosing topics and questions, but they're designing their own products or solutions. They're really thinking about that informed action piece. And this teacher isn't saying, oh, we're going to take informed action in this way. They're deciding how they will take informed action. And then all the way to free inquiry, where students are really choosing their topics, and they're not saying, the teacher's not saying, you need to do inquiry on this particular topic. They're really saying, all right, you go, what are you interested in? And that last one is often the one that people think about. But what you're going to want to think about is, what do you want to your classroom to look like 5 years from now? You're going to want to think about, what are your parameters in your space? What is your local community want inquiry to look like? What might be your situation where you're thinking much more about standards alignment or different kind of contextual pieces, and realizing that inquiry might not look the same in every place, and really deciding where on this continuum do you want your schools to be, or your particular school or your entire district, within a year, within 5 years, 10 years down the road, and then really setting your goal that way. I mentioned this before, but when people think inquiry, they often think of this free inquiry model. They get this picture in their mind of kind of this movie of what inquiry can look like, where students they're in a maker lab and everyone's doing their own thing and they're choosing their topics, and it's all kind of this, free for all of kind of where students are going. And I'm not going to tell you that that doesn't sound like a really amazing model, but I don't think that that is realistic. That model is realistic for all schools, especially in the shorter term. And so often I find that schools and districts, they get this picture of what inquiry looks like and they just say, nope, that's not something that's for us. And so what I encourage folks to do is to think about those earlier levels of the continuum of structured inquiry, controlled inquiry, guided inquiry, before they even begin to think about free inquiry. That free inquiry might not be something that they want to do in their buildings. And there's a lot of good reasons for not moving to free inquiry. I think that sometimes people think like if they're not doing it as free inquiry, it's not really student-centered, that students don't have enough agency about the work that they're doing, and so it's not really inquiry if you're not doing free inquiry. But I would argue that there can be a lot of student voice and choice within structured inquiry, controlled inquiry, and guided inquiry. And that you're going to want to think, as I keep talking about, as standards alignment and codification of experiences becomes much more challenging as you move along that continuum. And so you're going to want to think about what are the things that we have here that are really core to the work that we're doing, that we want to balance with student voice and choice, that we believe that students can be designing their own products or solutions, but that they can do that within the lens of thinking about the same content, that we can all be doing on making sure that we're hitting on our science standards about a particular topic, about physics, but we can put that into a guided inquiry process so students are going into a sustained investigation about physics, but then they're designing their own solutions about how that might be, and they're thinking about what that product might be, or they might not be, and you're really in the kind of beginning stages of this, and you want your teachers to really structuring that. That might be because your teachers aren't ready for moving towards guided inquiry, or you believe that the structure inquiry model is what you want inquiry looks like in your school buildings. So again, really thinking about what is the model that's right for your space and your context. Once you have that goal in mind, you can start to really think about getting to that goal. So how do you get there, right? So as I talked about earlier, this is not a kind of a short thing that's going to occur. You're not going to say, all right, I've got an inquiry goal. By next year, we're going to be here in this guided inquiry model. It's not going to happen. And so I think it's really important as you're thinking about your path of getting to your goal to start first with thinking about what your classrooms look like today. So there are a couple different models of how we usually see what's happening in schools and districts in terms of how they're thinking about inquiry. So I kind of like to put it again on a continuum of thinking from nascent to emerging to developing. In a nascent model, what I often find is that inquiry is completely new to both teachers and students. And what is really needing to occur is honestly a mindset shift. That you're needing to do some work around the what and why of inquiry, of thinking about why we want to move to this model. In an emerging model, you might have some pockets of inquiry. You might have a few teachers implementing inquiry practices, but you're really thinking about, all right, how do we take this from a couple of classrooms to our entire holistic model, that you're thinking about going beyond a few classrooms to the entire school, to an entire district, maybe moving from one subject area to an interdisciplinary approach. So you're really thinking about how we take these seeds and move them beyond that. To a developing model where teachers across the system might be beginning to implement inquiry, but you're really thinking about codification, thinking about how do we really solidify this model across the work. And so really thinking about where you are right now is going to determine how long, what tools you need, all of those things in determining how you're going to get to your goal. Once you've thought about where you are and where your goal is, you're going to want to go back to those challenges that we talked about. So that goal is not possible. If you think about your entry point to that goal, it's not possible to get to that goal unless you hit those challenges that I talked about head on. So in this last section, I want to really revisit those challenges that we talked about and really think a little bit about how you might specifically address these challenges in your context. So just to kind of review, like we talked a little bit about that shifting teacher practice. That shifting teacher practice can be very difficult. The lack of curricular tools can make making the shift to inquiry challenging. And that shifting takes time, that this isn't something that's going to happen overnight. So we'll take a few minutes to dive into each one of these to think about how you might address these particular challenges based on where your entry point is and where you're wanting to go with your goal. So shifting teacher practice. The first thing that I see across the board in contexts that are able to shift to an inquiry-based model is they invest in instructional leadership. Now, I want to say just a caveat to this, because a lot of times, as soon as we say invest in instructional leadership, people say, well, that sounds amazing. It's not that I don't want to have instructional coaches working on this with my teachers, but that's not a resource that I have at my fingertips. We don't have the resources to be able to do that. And so I'm tapping into individual teachers to be instructional leaders. And you know what? You've got to make your model work. So I'm not going to say that like you can't make a teacher leader model work. But I think if you're moving to a teacher model of instructional leaders, or you're having other people in your building that are instructional leaders, assistant principals, instructional coaches, those kinds of folks, they need to be tasked with saying, this is part of your job. That teachers are, if you're going to ask teachers to shift practice, there needs to be someone that is that flag bearer of moving to an inquiry-based model and providing feedback and support to make the shift. That they're not going to be able to make that shift if they're just kind of going into their own classroom, shutting the door, and hoping that they are making that shift. That somebody has to be tasked with doing that. And it really can't be from an accountability lens. It can't be from a, hey, I'm making, what is our teacher assessment, and are you doing these things? It has to be a feedback, or really a space to fail, to try to do those things. And instructional leaders can really be coaches in providing that support. Connecting professional learning to instructional practice. So one of the things that I talked about earlier is that when you go to a conference, or when you go to you have a PD provider come in and they come in for a day or two, what often happens is that PD is not directly connected to the day-to-day classroom instruction. So, for example, they might go to a conference, a teacher might go to a conference and they go to this amazing workshop on inquiry-based learning, and it takes them through the different steps of inquiry. But when they get back to their classroom, they have a scope and sequence sitting in front of them. They might have another curricular tool sitting in front of them. They might have a certain amount of content that they have to go through. And figuring out how they apply that particular PD model to, or that particular inquiry-based model to what they have in their classroom, it just doesn't happen. And so they're not able to connect those things. On the other side of the continuum, then you have PD providers saying they're coming in and doing PD, but it often just ends up being an onboarding into their tool. And so they get to know how to use this particular tool, but they don't connect it to what the shifts in their classroom they need to make. So you've got to push on your PD providers to really think about, how does this connect to instructional practice? And again, that connects back to instructional leaders. Instructional leaders are going to be the people, the boots on the ground, that are saying, all right, what does the day-to-day classroom look like? How do we connect this to our scope and sequence? How do we connect this to our standards, to our assessment? How do we pull all these things together and really connect what's happening, have our conversations in professional learning, our reflections, our feedback, be connected to what's happening in the day-to-day classroom? That those things need to be connected. You also need to provide the space and time. So the two things that I've said up above are not going to happen. Connecting professional learning to instructional practice isn't something that happens in a day. In instructional leadership, they need time to be in classroom and provide that feedback. So that means providing the space and time. That teachers need structured time for collaboration and reflection with colleagues. This can come in the form of PLCs. It can come in the form of, PD days, those kinds of things, but there needs to be time. I want to emphasize, and I should have made this word bold on the slide, the words structured. So I'll often go into schools and districts and say, well, we've moved to a PLC model, and we'll sit in on a PLC and they'll be, basically it's a staff meeting. They're going through kind of, hey, are you making sure that you're using this new attendance system? Are you making sure you're doing this? And kind of it's a check the box activity. And again, this connects back to instructional leadership. There needs to be someone that's saying, no, that's not what this time is for. This time is not for talking about the kind of day-to-day check the boxes things that we need to do. This time is for us to reflect on practice in the classroom. This is time for us to talk through what are the core practice shifts that need to be occurring. How do we have our students thinking critically? What does it mean to develop inquiry skills in our students? How do we shift to an inquiry-based assessment model? Those kinds of tough topics need to be what this space and time is. And so there needs to be structure around that. And so it needs to be part of somebody's job to really think about how do we structure this time? Or there needs to be tools for those instructional leaders and those teachers to be using. So curriculum for that time to really structure it so that it is about inquiry and it's about making this shift. The second challenge, as we talked about earlier, is around curricular tools. So, this is something that I think is a little bit, this first point of know that curricular tools aren't optional and going big. This might sound a little antithetical, again, to thinking about inquiry. So, a lot of my colleagues in the inquiry-based world will say, oh, curriculum is antithetical to inquiry, that we should be having the curricular that inquiry is contextualized, that students and teachers need to be making curriculum that is specific to their context. But I think there are a lot of challenges to that model, that when you're trying to go beyond one or two teachers doing this work and you're really trying to think about your entire school system moving to an inquiry-based model, I haven't seen a space where they've been able to make curricular tools as optional. That I've only seen success when those curricular tools are being used. And they can look a lot of different ways. And these next 2 points kind of hit on that. So you can choose to write your own, that you can choose to say, okay, we're going to write our own curricular tools. But I think that writing your own can bring its own challenges as well. That there are huge pros to writing your own. It can bring deep teacher engagement. That content can be very highly contextualized to your local context. So if your particular space is, you have a river going through your particular community and that river is really a core part of your community, you can contextualize your work around that river. Things like that, examples like that. But it can also bring some really huge cons. It can bring a lot of challenges if it's not done correctly. So oftentimes I will talk with district administrators and they'll say, we're choosing to write our own. And I'll say, okay, well, what does it look like to write your own content? And when we really dive into it, what they're doing is they're writing a scope and sequence for teachers. And oftentimes for a lot of teachers, that doesn't get them what they need to be able to go do this work in the classroom. Because again, inquiry is not just about shifting the what you teach, it's about shifting how you teach. And a scope and sequence is only giving you the what of what you're teaching. It's not giving you the how. And so the lift for an individualized school or district to go down to the lesson level, to the student-facing resource level, can be really challenging. And so they're not able to go down to that level. They don't have the resources, the time, the skill set, all of those things to be able to go down to that level. So they'll kind of stay at the high level and allow teachers to take it the rest of the way. And if your teachers are trained to do that, that's great. If you're in a space that can do that, that's amazing. But that also takes incredible collaboration. I was in a school where we had teachers really writing their own content. But one of the challenges we really struggled with is kind of the lone wolf strategy, kind of each teacher, whatever their passion project was, going off in their different directions and not thinking about the vertical integration of experiences. What does it look like to scaffold those experiences across? What does it look like to really think holistically? So now you're not just talking about grade level time, not just professional learning time for thinking about shifts in instructional practice, but also time for vertical integration of thinking about what does it look like for the experience across grade levels. So it's gonna be really challenging. Another challenge of writing your own curriculum is thinking about updating content. So in the world we live in today, we don't live in a static world. We get information to us incredibly quickly, and we've got to think about how are we adapting to that content. And so one of the real struggles is I've seen districts is they'll say, okay, we wrote this amazing content, but then in a few years it's really feeling old, it's feeling stale. And we're not able to provide, again, the resources, time, money, all those things into putting in and revising that content. Databases around getting that content out to folks, right? So they'll put it onto Google Drive or onto a repository or some sort of space like that, but teachers really struggle with PDFs and things like that and getting to that content. So kind of that keeping it updated and how it gets to folks can be really challenging in writing your own. And there are a lot of other challenges in writing your own that can be, that when you're trying to go big with inquiry, that can really provide some challenges there. The other side of the coin is if you're not writing your own, what you'll often see people go out there and they'll say, all right, let me find a curriculum that's inquiry based. And as an inquiry based curriculum provider, obviously I have an opinion about this. I think there's a lot of curriculum out there that's saying that it's inquiry based. They're saying they're using the word inquiry or project based learning or some deeper learning or something like that. And they're saying that we're inquiry based. But I will tell you, if the tool doesn't allow for contextualization, if the tool is giving you a question and then just giving the answer on the next page, and there's only one conclusion that the students can come to, then it's not inquiry. Then inquiry is about, if you want those, is about students coming to their own conclusions. That if you want students really diving deep into an investigation, they can't feel that there's only one answer. The kids are smart. They know when they're being duped. They know when they're on an investigation that has a clear-cut answer and there's only one answer, that there's no kind of paths to go on. And so inquiry needs to provide that space for sustained investigation and really students drawing their own conclusions and taking informed action and doing something with that knowledge. And so you've got to really push on those curriculum providers to think about, is this curriculum inquiry based? Does it allow my teachers to make contextualized decisions based on the students in their classroom, based on their local context? And does it allow students to really go on their own sustained investigation? You're also going to want to think about the taking time piece. And this is really where I think a strong administrator is really important. And that might be multiple administrators, multiple layers of administration coming in and really being strong about knowing that this shift is going to take time. So I think starting that work with your school is about communicating the goal. So I talked a little bit about if you're in a nascent model and you've got only a few kind of teachers maybe doing this work, or you have no one is doing this work, and inquiry is really new to both your students, to your teachers, to your community, you gotta want to make sure that all stakeholders know the what and the why of the shift. They can't be guessing at why you think that it's important to shift to an inquiry-based model. So you've got to really say, hey, here's what we're doing and here's why we're doing it. And I think you're going to get some people who say, I don't agree, but there's got to be a really strong, this is our goal. Once you've got that goal in mind, you've got to, administrators have to stay laser focused on that goal and stay the course. So change does not come easily. Human beings, we don't like change, right? You're going to get a lot of pushback from folks. You're going to get teachers saying, oh, my old model was working. Why are we changing anything? My students aren't able to know the answer on a test. So obviously this isn't working, because inquiry is going to take some time to get that model implemented. That it's going to look a little different in terms of how you're assessing learning. It's going to look a little different in terms of how you're building that knowledge in students, about how you're developing those skills in students. And so you're going to get some pushback. That might be coming from parents. It might be coming from school administrators. You might have a principal. If you're a district administrator, you might have some principals saying, hey, this isn't working. You're holding me accountable to this particular testing metric, and then you're not giving me any space to say that this is going to look different in my space. That end goal can't be flexible. If you're saying that maybe we'll try out inquiry for a little bit and see what happens over a few months, you're just not going to get it off the ground. And so I think it's really up to administrators to say, no, this is the model that we have to move to in order to truly engage and activate and prepare students for not only the world that we're living in tomorrow, but the world that they live in today. And so it's got to be the administrator that says, we're sticking with this, and here's how we're going to do it. I think this last piece is also kind of embedded in those two that I talked about, is what I sometimes see is then administrators will say, all right, we're staying the course. And what that means is they'll go straight to a very accountable model. And they'll say, like, are you checking the boxes? Have you provided the impact we need to do? But just because inquiry is going to take time to get off the ground, impact is going to take time to get it off the ground. So you're going to want to empower failure, right? Like it's okay for teachers to try this out and not get it right the first time. But what's not okay is not trying. And what I'll see sometimes is administrators saying, well, I want to get teacher buy-in, and so I'm going to make this optional. And then we're going to see what happens, and I want to really make sure that everybody's trying. And so they make it optional, and then kind of a couple teachers try it out. Maybe it keeps going, maybe it doesn't. And I'm not in any way advocating for not starting small, starting with pilots, starting with a couple of teachers, first having an optional. But once you've decided, yes, no, we're moving forward with this is where we're going, and you've implemented a tool, or you've said, this is the thing that we're all trying out, administrators really need to make sure that teachers are trying that out, that they're trying, they're failing, they're succeeding, they're playing around, and they're reflecting on their implementation. But that trying part of it can't be, an optional piece of it once you've really decided, yes, we're moving towards an inquiry-based model. So as I've talked about, these are not easy things. The things that I'm asking you to implement are not gonna come easily. And so I think the biggest takeaway when you're moving to an inquiry-based model is this is a complex journey, and it should be. I've often talked with folks we have a web application, and we spent a lot of time thinking about the user experience, the design of that web application. And people will ask us, well, this is really nicely done. There's a lot of other tools that teachers are using that might not be as nicely designed. And I said, well, it should be. Why should a tool that we are using it's a social media application that we're using in our lives, or some other app that we're using on our phone, be something that's just kind of like, oh, no big deal, let's just throw something in front of people, like with our students? The work that we are doing with our students should be complex. It is not an easy job to prepare our students for the world they live in and the world they'll be living in tomorrow. And so this should be a complex journey. Don't let any of the things that I've told you about the challenges shifting to an inquiry-based model be the reason why you don't do this work. It is the work that we should be doing for our students. And knowing that there's going to be bumps, and knowing what some of those bumps are going to be, are really going to ensure that you're moving along that path, and that while that inquiry goal might not be achievable in the short term, it is something that you're keeping it kind of on the horizon and saying, this is where we're going, and we're going to stick to it because this is the work we should be doing for our students. So we at InquireEd, as I told you, spend a lot of time thinking about inquiry. We've put out white papers, we put out a lot of different things thinking about what inquiry should look like. So if you are interested in getting some of those resources, we're happy to follow up with you. If you could go into the chat right now and just put a yes into the chat, then we'll know that you've opted in to getting those resources from us, and we can send you an email with those resources. So just put yes in the chat and type that in, and then we'll make sure to send you some resources. And then also, if you would rather, or in addition to, always feel to email us if you have specific questions. If you want to do just a kind of a one-to-one consultation with us to talk about where your district or school is in its inquiry-based model and where you'd like to go, and help us determine that path for you, we're happy to do that. Just send us an email at info@inquireed.org, or send me an email specifically at shanti@inquireed.org, and we're happy to do a call with you to talk about what this can look like in your specific context. And then I'd love to kind of wrap up today with questions from you all, and hear what you all are kind of struggling with. What are some of the challenges that you're having, or where you'd like me to dive deeper in terms of some of the content that we've covered today. Thank you all for joining, and I'd love to hear your questions.
All right, thank you so much for that information, Shanti. We've got a few people who've typed in yes to the questions box. Want to make sure you are typing into the questions box. It will record your answer there, and then we will get your email address to InquireEd for those additional resources. We've got a few questions for you, Shanti, just to get us started here. How do you get parents on board with a shift to inquiry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one of the biggest pieces that you have at your kind of at your fingertips in terms of making a shift to inquiry is the taking informed action piece of it. So one of the things that I found is that parents will start to be kind of a little wary. You're kind of moving to an inquiry-based model. You're like, this is looking a little different. This isn't how I how I learned, right? Why aren't my students being told kind of the answer? Why are they being kind of trying to be asked to come to their own conclusions? Why are they still studying this particular topic? A lot of questions around that kind of thing. Is this going to prepare my students for the test that they're going to need to take? When you have student parents come in and community members come in for a public presentation, so as students take informed action, they're often choosing an audience. They are choosing an audience that they are going to present to. And sometimes that can be a local audience. So that might be their local class, like another classroom. It could be parents. Inviting parents in for those opportunities, I often find that you take a huge group of naysayers, and all of a sudden they get it. They say, wow, I cannot believe what my student is an expert on now. The depth of knowledge that they have, the skills that they're applying is totally different than what I would have expected from my students. And so that can be one way, is inviting folks in to see the work that students are doing. The other piece I will say is having conversations with parents. What do you want for your students? What do you want them to be prepared for? Asking them, what do you think your students need in order to get the jobs that you want them to have the opportunities that you want them to have? And I think leading community forums around discussions like that and helping parents really understand that giving students a worksheet is not going to develop critical thinking skills in their students, but knowing that all of our parents aren't educators and allowing them to say, what is the goal that they have for their students? And then you helping them backwards map to what needs to be happening in the school building in order to prepare them for that kind of work, is really an important piece of getting parents on board.
Excellent. We had a question about the accessibility of the recording of this webinar. Yes, it was recorded. I will be sending the link out to all registrants and participants, and then it will be archived on edleadersnetwork.org in our live webinar archive. So yes, you will be able to get to this in the future. Question here, Shanti, for you. Do you know of any school districts in Illinois that are doing this model that we could visit and see firsthand?
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to send, if that person can chat to you, we'll send kind of a list of folks that we think would be a good places to visit that are great ones. So we'll put a list together and send it to that person. Arlen, can you get that person's, I don't know if that person's chatting in the question, if you have that person's email, we can send that to them directly.
Okay, yes, I will take it down. Okay, another question. Should we write our own inquiry-based curriculum?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting that I'm a little bit of a naysayer on writing your own curriculum. The reason, because I used to write my own curriculum when I was a teacher in the classroom, but I think that it really presents a lot of challenges, as I talked about earlier, is that I think it's really, really difficult. I often give the analogy of, you know, my partner, my husband's a physician and he's a surgeon, and he's not asked to create the scalpel that he's going to use during surgery. He's asked to be an expert in how to wield that scalpel. And so I think that oftentimes teachers have not gone through rigorous training to think about what does it mean to write curriculum? What does it look like to do that? And so when you ask teachers who often did not grow up in learning in an inquiry-based model, might not know what an inquiry model, have never taught an inquiry-based model, and you're asking them to write something that they've never done and taught, that can be really overwhelming. And then you don't end up with really high quality resources. And so I think that there are really great pros to writing your own in terms of teacher engagement, in terms of the contextualization that can occur. But I think the cons of how you actually get that work off the ground, for me, I just haven't seen it done really well. I can think of very few circumstances that I've seen it done when people are really going big with inquiry that it's been successful. I often find that people try it out, and we have a lot of partners that we talk to with that end up coming to us because they've tried it on their own and they've really struggled and they haven't been able to get it really off the ground. They've got this cohort who wrote the curriculum really running with it, and then everybody else is kind of like, this isn't enough for me to really run with. This is just giving me kind of a framework, and I'm not really able to apply this. Because what often happens is the people who are writing the curriculum are your teacher leaders who may have already been doing this work in their classrooms, and it's that kind of big cohort of other folks that weren't just running with from the get-go that have trouble running with something that doesn't go down to the real kind of brass tacks model.
Okay, that's great. Appreciate that. I had a few more people type in that they would also like to learn about districts in Illinois.
Okay.
So I'll make sure I'll get you all those email addresses, Shanti, so you can follow up with them directly.
Perfect.
Also, how can we grow a pilot program into a full shift?
Yeah, it's a great question. What we find is that teacher leaders is kind of the opposite of what I just said, is that starting with teacher leaders is a really important part of this. So a little bit of this depends is if you're talking about a district kind of shift or a system shift across multiple buildings, or if you're talking about one particular school building. So when we see an entire district or school system trying to shift, what we'll sometimes see is that they'll start a pilot in one particular school and then try to shift that across. We see that that pilot is not going to be successful unless there are individual teachers within every building as a part of that pilot. Because otherwise, you're not having someone on the ground who's right there, who's really understanding what this can look like and being that teacher leader that everybody can go to and say, hey, I've got questions about this. How do we do this work? So first of all, I would encourage, if you're talking about a larger school system, to have pilot participants across the system. If you're talking about an individual school building, I think that the curricular tools aspect is absolutely necessary in order to move that pilot. Because again, it goes back to the question about, should we write our own curriculum? What often is the path is that a district will say, or school will say, we're going to move to an inquiry-based model. So we've got a couple of teachers and they're going to go, we already see that they're kind of moving to this inquiry-based model. They're really excited about this. They maybe went to a conference and they're really like, let's go, let's do this. So those teachers end up being the ones who write that content. And then they're not able to then translate. They go and they present that content to the rest of the cohort, or the rest of the teachers, and it's really difficult for the other teachers to kind of grasp that and run with that. So if you're going to write your own, or if you're going to bring in a curricular tool, you've got to make sure that that curricular tool is robust enough to support that teacher who has no idea what inquiry looks like, that has never done this work. And so I almost, in my mind, I like to think about, as we're designing curriculum at Inquire Ed, we often think about the teacher that has their arms crossed in the professional development, that is like, there's no way this model is going to work in my classroom. And what do we need to provide them with in order to make the shift to an inquiry-based model? That if we think about just kind of our superhero teacher leaders in designing content, we're not going to get to those folks that really need to do this, that are going to have the biggest challenge in shifting practice. And so I think curricular tools are really needed when you're shifting from a pilot to the larger adoption.
Very good. All right. Well, Shanti, thank you so much for your time this morning and presenting this great information on the inquiry-based model that you're working with at Inquire Ed. We've got everybody's emails. Again, if you just want to type yes into the questions box, they will follow up with you. Shanti will, and she'll make sure to get you the additional resources that they have available. I don't see any other questions at this time.
Perfect.
So participants, really appreciate you joining us on the webinar this morning. You are free to close the GoToWebinar control panel, and that will log you out of the system. Take care and have a great rest of the day. Thank you, Shanti.
Thank you.